Thanks, Bruno, and thanks all of you for that warm welcome. I'm going to move pretty quickly this morning. Time is short. The slides are available on SlideShare, and you can check Twitter for the link. I'm going to be talking about the architecture of understanding. A couple of notes about my background, and we'll dive right in. So my academic background is in library and information science. I'm one of those crazy librarians who fell in love with the web back in the early 1990s. But most of my career has been spent outside the walls of libraries, helping a wide range of organizations to solve their information architecture and user experience challenges. Along the way, I've written a number of animal books about information architecture and ambient findability and search. And we'll touch on each of these topics today. In fact, it's hard not to talk about them all because, as I hope you'll agree by the end, they're all hopelessly intertwinkled. Now, there's been a lot of negative energy in our community over the years around defining the damn thing. And let me just be clear. I don't care at all about job titles. From my perspective, everybody is an information architect. So we shouldn't worry so much about what it says on our business cards, but we do need to keep redefining and reframing what we do. Technology is changing the world so rapidly that we just simply can't get locked into a particular vision of who we are and what we do. We need to keep thinking expansively. For instance, in the Polar Bear book on information architecture, we wrote a number of fairly specific definitions explaining what is information architecture in the context of large websites. And these definitions had a lot of value at the time, but the world has moved on, and we need to move beyond these definitions again to think more expansively. I don't think that means that we leave behind the old. In fact, classic information architecture, structuring and organizing large-scale websites is more difficult and more important than ever. But at the same time, we have all sorts of new opportunities in the area of web strategy, bridging web and mobile and social experiences, cross-channel, bridging physical and digital experiences, and in what we might call ubiquitous information architecture, where we're entering the intertwinklearity, all sorts of new technologies and new possibilities that we're only just beginning to contemplate. Now, I've always thought that information architecture was about much more than the web or any particular technology platform, because it cuts deep to the heart of some timeless issues such as categorization. Right? This is one of my favorite information architecture books, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. And George Lakoff explains there's nothing more basic than categorization to our thought, perception, action, and speech. We organize to understand. So let me tell a few stories to explain how I see information architecture evolving. I was brought into the Library of Congress a few years ago, initially just to do an evaluation of their web presence. And I was brutally honest. I told them that their web presence resembled the Winchester Mystery House. It's a well-known California mansion that was under construction continuously for 38 years. Apparently, the widow who lived there had been told by a psychic, when your house is complete, you will die. So she kept adding room after room after room. By the end, there were hundreds of rooms, doorways, staircases, and no blueprint. Now, it's not an unattractive house, and the view from any particular room isn't unusual, but it's a findability nightmare. And that's what I argued the Library of Congress had created with their mix of brands and websites and navigation systems and so forth. So I wrote my big report, a 100-page report, and I flew out to Washington, D.C. to present my findings and my recommendations. And I was told when I arrived that my report had been embargoed. It was it had the risk of making people too upset, and so I couldn't present to all of these groups. I met with the chief information officer of the library, and she said, "We agree with you, but we can't let people see this." Well, a few months went by, and the report moved throughout the organization, finally moved up to the top level, and the executive committee of the library decided we need to really change how we work on the web. We're going to form a web governance board at the highest level. We're going to take a more centralized approach to sort of really come up with a consistent way of designing our sites. And since this guy told us all about the problems, we're going to bring him back to help solve them. So we started with the web strategy. And my first contribution was to argue we can call it a web strategy, but we really need to think beyond the web. This is about bridging the on-site, the physical library with the digital on the web. It's about bringing web and online up to par with the physical infrastructure. And then we dug into the information architecture, and I did a lot of wireframes for the library, sketching out the major pages and interfaces. And that is the most tangible, kind of actionable deliverable that I provided to the library. But I would argue that some of my most important contributions were more conceptual in nature, helping the folks at the library to think differently about how they work on the web, to look for points of leverage, to think carefully about the infrastructure that they're creating, to recognize that search isn't simply about an interface or an engine, that at its best, it's a complex adaptive system with feedback loops that enable learning over time. Now, they've only just begun to implement some of these changes. It'll be another year or so before we see some of the major transformation going on. But it's nice to see that they've begun where I recommended with the search system, right? Really setting up a robust search infrastructure that's fast, that's integrated, that supports faceted navigation, that really helps people to navigate and find what they're looking for. And I'd like to juxtapose this search results interface with a quote by Jorge Arango in the Journal of Information Architecture. Jorge says, "Where architects use forms and spaces to design environments for inhabitation, information architects use nodes and links to create environments for understanding." I think that's a very important and profound concept and really important to the way we're going to move ahead in our practice. Now, we create environments for understanding when we design interfaces and architectures, right? This search results interface serves as a map, a custom map to the search results. It helps me understand what have I found, what's here, what's nearby. And then it provides a path forward, some simple next steps. It's a combination of a map and a path. But we also create environments for understanding for our clients and colleagues, helping them to understand what's possible. Another real quick story. I'm working with a Fortune 500 right now, and there are things about their web presence that have a lot in common with this popular comic, right? The things that the users want are radically different than the things that marketing is trying to push towards them. There's this big separation between marketing and support, between push and pull. Now, let me just try something new here for a second. I'm going to ask you to do two simple things and one thing that's a little bit harder. Okay, first thing, just breathe in. Nice deep breath. Okay, now, second thing, breathe out. Okay. Now I want you to try to do both at the same time. Okay, any success? No? Trying to breathe in and out at the same time is similar to trying to sell and help people at the same time. Right? There's something fundamental going on in a lot of our organizations where the desire from marketing to push, to kind of get people to try new products and services is conflicting with the need to really listen to customers, to really look at their behaviors and how we can help them be more successful. Another recent project with the Kresge Foundation, a major philanthropy. This was a fairly traditional web redesign project. We began doing user research, really studying the needs and behaviors of grant seekers, the people who want money, and grantees, the people who've been given money. And we used the user experience Honeycomb to have a good discussion about priorities, right? Which of these qualities of the user experience are most important to the foundation? And we did a nice job of redesigning the site, really taking it up a level. The most interesting part of the project, though, for me, was helping the institution to come to terms with social media. This is an organization with a lot of very smart people who are subject matter experts, but they're not technology geeks. And so I had to deal with a very wide range of opinions and misconceptions about social media. In one meeting, after presenting our vision for the web, an IT guy raised his hand and he said, "Well, I just read an article in Wired magazine that says the web is dead. So why do we need a website? Can't we just do this all on Facebook?" So I had to explain why that might not be the best approach. At the other end of the spectrum was where most of the senior executives were. And they said, "We don't need to worry about this social media stuff. That's more for kids and people who have too much time on their hands. Right? We don't need to tell everybody what we had for breakfast." So I had another educational challenge there. And in fact, I did a number of sort of educational sessions, brown bag lunches for a large group of staff, one-on-one conversation with the president, really trying to raise the level of understanding and comfort with social media. And I'm really proud that I was able to help the organization to formulate more of a multi-channel communication strategy, to start using Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and other channels to get their message out to people where they are in the way that they want, and also to create the opportunity for new types of conversation, right, where the foundation can work better with grantees and grant seekers and help advance the state of philanthropy. I've worked this year with Macy's.com, and here's an organization that's doing some fascinating stuff on the web, but they've made things so complex it's really hard to figure out what's going on in order to be able to move things forward. When I was first brought in, the user experience team said, "We just want you to focus on the left-hand navigation because that's all we have control over." Okay? So it was immediately obvious to me that one of my big challenges was not just to fix that left-hand navigation, but to explain to executives why that's not a proper framing for a user experience team, right? The proper framing should not be the left-hand navigation. It should not just be the entire website. It should be the entire customer experience across channels. Right? So they're not quite ready to dive into cross-channel yet. They have to understand how this stuff fits together. Now, it became obvious to me a few years ago that information architecture was going well beyond websites, and so I wrote an article called Ubiquitous Service Design. And I pointed out what I like to call the intertwingularity, drawing upon Ted Nelson's quote. People keep pretending they can make things deeply hierarchical, categorizable, and sequential when they can't. Everything is deeply intertwingled. Well, what's going on right now is the intertwingling of all of our disciplines: information architecture, interaction design, service design, user experience design. They're all converging around a similar set of challenges and creating great opportunities for collaboration, but we have to learn from one another. In the article, I argued that information is blurring the lines between products and services to create multi-channel, cross-platform, transmedia, physico-digital user experiences. Now that's a real mouthful. Part of the problem is this stuff's so new, we don't yet have the right words. We don't have a shared vocabulary. And yet we know it when we see it. The Apple iTunes ecology was the first large-scale, very well-known example of true cross-channel design, where they made some really smart decisions about which features belong on the iPod versus the desktop application versus the online store. They struck a nice balance between platform-specific optimization and cross-channel consistency. Now, there's a reason why Apple was there first, and that's because they had the world's best information architect. And I believe that Apple will sorely miss his leadership and vision in the years ahead, because there's a certain amount of conviction and the implementation of authority necessary to streamline some of this work. But of course, there are many, many examples now of cross-channel design, whether it's Nike Plus putting sensors in our shoes and turning running from a solitary physical activity into a shared online collaborative experience. Or Zipcar, where we're using our mobile devices to transform cars from products into services. Or Redbox. This is one of my favorites. Back in the 1990s, who would have ever imagined that we would be using mobile devices to search for DVDs inside giant red boxes? This was not part of the official vision of the future, and yet this is an organization that's found a very profitable niche. And speaking of mobile devices, they're sprouting sensors like crazy. Right? We haven't even begun to figure out what to do with all of these sensors. And it's not just our mobile devices, it's our toothbrushes and our medicine bottles, which can make phone calls now to patients, to doctors. They help Gramps to stay on his meds. And it's our scales, right, where we can tweet our weight automatically every time we step on the scale. This is a good example. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And then there's augmented reality, which caused a lot of fuss a few years ago, but it has some problems, right? You go to a strange city, you're a little nervous, you're trying to find your way, and you're holding up your $500 iPhone, waving it around for everyone to see. Fortunately, this is going to be solved by the end of the year. Google's coming out with augmented reality glasses. Keep an eye out for people standing on street corners, nodding their head and doing strange head cursor movements. Now, I can't talk about the future without talking about this device, the BrainPort. This is a device to help blind people see. You've got these glasses on. There's a video camera pointing forward. It brings the image in. The image is recreated on a grid of 400 electrodes that you put on your tongue. Within a short amount of time, the brain recognizes that this is visual information and starts processing it that way, and you literally see through your tongue well enough to drive a car, to shoot baskets. This is a good wake-up call. The future isn't just about the mobile device and multi-touch. We're going to have all sorts of weird opportunities for input and output. Now back to the present. I started trying to create a touchpoint taxonomy to make sense of all these touch points at our disposal. And I quickly realized that's impossible. It's far too complex. We need to take a faceted approach, because there are many different ways to describe touch points, whether it's by channel, device, platform, scale, media, or context. And this isn't the future, this is the reality today. And at the center of this chaos are our users and our customers. And it's our job to help make sense of this. Now, I started trying to think about some design principles for cross-channel design and quickly realized I think we're too early for this. We don't know enough to formulate design principles, but maybe we can start to explore some of the qualities that we should be thinking about as we do this work. So I came up with the cross-channel crystal. You might notice all the words begin with C. Let me just touch on a few of these. So composition, we're talking about the mix of platforms and devices and media. We're aiming for some sort of integration, some coherence. Consistency, as I mentioned earlier, we need to strike a balance between cross-channel consistency and platform-specific optimization. Right? Consistency isn't always good. We should aim for connection, links across channels, continuity, helping users to maintain a state of flow as they move between devices, designing for context, and figuring out how to deal with cross-channel conflicts, right? Whether it's the org chart that needs redesigning or a free rider problem where people are using our service but buying from someone else. So here's one example. People use multi-channel and cross-channel interchangeably very often, but there's value in teasing these terms apart, where multi-channel refers to taking the same product or service and pushing it out in almost identical fashions across multiple channels. Cross-channel involves making those careful decisions about which features belong on which platform and aiming for integration across channels. So responsive web design is a good example of a multi-channel strategy. Right? We're going to have the same website rolled out across desktop, tablet, and mobile platforms. Right? The Boston Globe being a good example. But it's not the only approach. Luke Wroblewski made a really good argument in an article he wrote about his experience working at BagCheck about why they made the decision to design very different interfaces for the mobile device versus the desktop web. All sorts of ways to optimize for the mobile device, whether it's the design of the user interface, where the navigation system goes, how to deal with video, and tapping into the device capabilities, location awareness, barcode scanning, and so on. The point is, you can't just say, we're going to do cross-channel or multi-channel. You have to think carefully about a strategy, what makes sense for our organization. You need to look at the analytics, the statistics, how many people are accessing via mobile. I did a workshop earlier this year at the Information Architecture Summit in the US with Samantha Starmer, who's been working at REI, helping to keep them on the leading edge of cross-channel design. One of their early steps was to recognize that they weren't communicating the same basic information about their products across channels, from email to web to the store to the catalog to the phone support system. They might use different product names, descriptions, even prices. And so they made a decision to change the org chart to bring all of their content creators under one creative director so that they could really start to move towards consistency in their language and organization across channels. It's a good reminder that if we're going to do this work, we have to be willing to redesign the org chart. It forces us up to a strategic level. Now, REI also does a great job of designing for connection. You go to their website, and you'll see that you can get free shipping with in-store pickup. More than 50% of the business is picked up in the store. This is great for customers. It's also great for the business. It drives people into the store where now there's an opportunity for cross-selling and upselling and developing more of a relationship. You get into the store, and there's URLs everywhere, on the printed literature, even on the receipts. They're experimenting with barcode scanning, QR codes, mobile applications, in-store kiosks that let you do price checks, look for product details, and buy online if you didn't find exactly what you want in the store. I mentioned continuity. Netflix provides a good example. I can start watching a documentary on my big screen TV at home, and then when I dash for the airport, I can pick up where I left off on my iPhone, just hitting the resume button, right? Maintaining that state of flow. Borders, good example of a company that didn't learn to deal with cross-channel conflict. They never really figured out the web. I would often browse in Borders, find some good books, and then order them on Amazon for 30% cheaper, right? That's why they're out of business. And designing for context, it's not just about location, it's about all of the contextual factors. Am I alone? Am I with friends? Am I at home? Am I at work? We could go on. Now, how are we going to confront these massive challenges? Well, let me explain via a metaphor. So I'm a long-distance runner. I've done a couple of marathons over the years, and I know how to train for a marathon. You run, and you run, and you run. But that wouldn't have done me much good last fall when I did my first Olympic distance triathlon. I would have either drowned in the lake or crashed on my bike. I had to practice sports that I'm not good at and learn from those who are. And that's what we all need to do in our work. We have to leave our comfort zones, cross-train, and collaborate. Fortunately, a lot of our tools and methods are portable. We can bring them to the challenge of cross-channel design. But we should also be drawing from other disciplines, such as service design and the service blueprint. We need to keep exploring different ways to document the customer journey. Experience maps, cross-channel blueprints. I like UX swim lanes because it puts concepts together with sketches that sort of put us in the mindset of the user. Now, again, I think we need to keep thinking expansively about what we do. I use this phrase: I'm an information architect. I map paths and places across physical, digital, and cognitive spaces. Now that works for me. It's a bit philosophical for most. Sometimes it's best to go back to basics. What architects do for buildings, information architects do for, and you fill in the blank, whether it's user experiences, interactive services, or understanding. Now, to wrap up, let me shift gears quickly here. I wrote an article for the Journal of Information Architecture called The System of Information Architecture. I did quite a bit of digging into the literature of systems thinking, going back over several decades, and the work there resonated with me powerfully. I really enjoyed this book, Thinking in Systems, where Donella argues there's a problem discussing systems with words, because words and sentences must come only one at a time in linear, logical order, whereas systems happen all at once. And she makes the point that to discuss systems, we have to use a language that shares some of the same properties as the phenomena under discussion, a visual language. Okay? That really applies to what we do as well. In the article, I argue that in an era of cross-channel experiences and product service systems, it makes less and less sense to design sitemaps and wireframes without also mapping the customer journey, modeling the system dynamics, and analyzing impacts on business processes, incentives, and the org chart. And I argue that information architects are bridge builders. And on that note, let me change channels to close, switching over to Kresge. So information architects are bridge builders. I'm almost done, but I'm worried that maybe you still don't really understand what I'm talking about when I talk about information architecture. Because so far we haven't talked about the IA mindset. For instance, while we're motivated by business goals, IAs are inspired by our empathy for the user, which actually makes us even better at helping business. And while we do care about pages, we care even more about how the parts relate to the whole, the structures and relationships and categories. And while we pay attention to the surface, we look for leverage in the deep layers of structure. I've always been a big fan of Stuart Brand's concept of pace layering, the idea that the fast parts learn and get all the attention, but the slow parts are where we get our stability and that have all the power. If we pop back to PowerPoint here, back in 2003, I did a lot of work for the National Cancer Institute. I was very proud of this work, and what amazes me is almost 10 years later now, there's been a visual refresh, there have been lots and lots of updates to the content, and yet the information architecture remains almost the same. Right? Sometimes things change much more slowly than we expect. On the other hand, I think about Richard Saul Wurman's sandcastles. Before he was an information architect, Mr. Wurman was an architect, and he built these homes that people really lived in. Well, fast forward, and you can imagine what's happened. Those sandcastles have been eroded over time. And in fact, many of Wurman's works have started to fade away. Right? Many of his books are now out of print. Whether you love him or hate him, Richard Saul Wurman was a tremendously prolific person. He founded the TED Conference. He has written and published more books than most people will ever read. And yet, many of his things have started to fade. He's outlived many of his own creations. Right? Sometimes things don't last as long as we might expect. So back to information architects. We appreciate that the analysis and design of nonlinear systems requires a visual language. We've touched on this. And as systems thinkers, we recognize the importance of selecting the right frame of reference by zooming in and by zooming out. So in conclusion, information architects are planners, organizers, and bridge builders. But most importantly, we're architects of understanding. We help our users to understand where they are, what they found, what to expect, and what's around. And we help our clients to understand what's possible. And I would argue that our biggest impacts, the things that will last the longest, are not our interfaces. It's not our architectures. It's the impact that we have on one another. It's the teaching that we do. It's the encouraging that we do. Right? We're not just architects of information, we're also architects of inspiration and of understanding. And with that, I thank you for your attention.